Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Reading. It's like being completely present and completely absent at the same time.
Hello, welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for those of us who can't walk past any book without at least curiously checking the back cover. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Michaela Andreev.
And we have a bit of a food thing going in this episode because you, Michaela, have had a fascinating talk with an author who's used food to tell her story and the story of Japanese culture.
That's right. I had a chat a little while ago with Katherine Tamiko Arguile. She's written a book called Meshi, A Personal History of Japanese Food, and it's absolutely wonderful. Katherine is a self-described hafu. That means she's half English and half Japanese, and she spends the book really trying to reconcile those two halves of her life. It's a book of loss, of love, of food, of so much more. And I'll leave most of the explaining to Katherine in the interview just shortly. But I guess just what I want to convey is how much I loved this book.
So much that you kept it.
Exactly. I kept it, which, although, like all of us in Sundoku, I do have a big pile of books beside my bed, sort of the in tray, so to speak. But the out tray I keep quite empty. I don't have a house that is lined with bookshelves. I'm quite ruthless. Once I've finished a book, I give it back to the person I've borrowed it from. I take it back to the library. I donate it to the local, op shop.
You're so good. I don't. I've got a house lined with books.
I know. Well, and I feel like a bit of a traitor to the cause that I don't. But it's just my thing. I guess if I got started, I know that I would never stop. But this book is different. I keep the books that I know I'm going to read again. And so this book, I have written my name in the front of it. I have given it some very rare real estate on my bookshelf, and I'm going to go back to it again and again. It's marvellous.
Okay, we're looking forward to that, and we'll stay with food because I'll be talking later to Adelaide devoted foodie Kate Jordan-Moore about the best, the most beloved and the most outrageous cookbooks out there these days, as well as which classics have stood the test of time.
Well, let's get going with Katherine's story. I can't wait to share it with everyone. As you know, in Australia, we have 4 seasons, or 6, I guess, if you're up north. But in Japan, if you can believe it, they have 72 seasons. There's 24 what are called sekki, and there are 3 ko within each of those 24 sekki. So I began by saying to Katherine, please explain.
It was a calendar devised to help farmers with growing things. And predominantly rice is obviously the most key crop in Japan. The whole society is built around it. So given the precariousness of rice growing and all the sort of savage typhoons that come in September, the rains and all of that, they took the Chinese calendar and then broke it down further. So the sekki are closer to what was used in China, and there are 24 of those. And then within each sekki, there are 3 5-day-long ko. And that's quite a Japanese thing. And what I really loved about all of it, really, the sekki and the ko, are the names of them.
Yes.
They're incredibly poetic. The names were devised actually by the court poet at the time. Titles like First Rainbows Appear or Wild Geese Fly North. Those are just gorgeous names for seasons, and they're so small, but they're also not quite accurate either. So
I saw one, a shosho, so
shosho, yeah.
lesser heat.
Yes.
So that is the sekki.
Yes.
And then the 3 ko were warm winds blow, first lotus blooms, hawks learn to fly.
Yeah, isn't that gorgeous?
It's just lovely.
I find it incredibly oddly moving.
And I think you really bring that forth in the book, where you point out that the seasons are reflected in everything.
Yes.
In the ikebana, in the wrestling, in the poetry, in the theatre, in the crockery, in the dress.
Yes.
I think my favourite 2 things in the book that really bring this home is that KFC has a Christmas line, Kentucky Christmas, and that newsreaders announced the start of the Matsutake mushroom season.
Yes.
That's quite incredible.
Yep.
What were some of your favourite things that mark the seasons? I mean, I know your book is a celebration of all of them, but are there ones in particular that...
Oh, summer. Summer is just so celebratory. The summer is when the Obon season comes, which I find that concept so fascinating because it's replicated elsewhere too, most notably in Mexico, the Dia de Con Muertas, I think.
Yes.
It is a bit different, but the souls of the departed and all the ancestors return to the homes of the living loved ones for a visit. And so people will light little bonfires so that the spirits can see their way home and then back again. It just is over a few days. But in that time, there's dancing and singing to entertain them. The whole family will go to the cemetery and make food offerings and talk to people. I mean, we talked to my late uncle, and it was just a happy occasion, actually, and a really nice way of remembering people that we loved who've gone.
Yeah. So each chapter you tend to begin with what's happening in nature, which very quickly in your case brings you to food.
Yes.
And that is what is happening with the farmers, what's happening in the markets, what's happening in the shops, what's happening in the restaurants, what's happening in your mother's kitchen. But we're quickly into food. And then we find ourselves taken somewhere different each time. So that discussion of nature and then food might take us to cicadas. It might take us to the Obon festival, which you were talking about, the returning home in summer. It might take us to stationery, where you talk to us about Japan being the sovereign state of stationery.
Yes.
Well, it's the home of Hello Kitty. Of course it is.
Oh, the best.
So what I'm getting at, there's a lot of detail in there, and it was an absolute joy to just read this book. And I read it slowly with Wikipedia next to me because there is so much there to explore, and it was so much fun.
Oh, I'm so pleased.
But I'm assuming with a memoir you can only remember so much. So how much research did you have to put in to give us a book that is as rich as Meshi?
Quite a bit. I think when you grow up in a place and there are certain traditions, and as a child you don't necessarily question the origins of it or where it came from. And I think it's not just because I'm half English. I think it's the same for most Japanese people. And I just wanted to make sure I had the background of everything, just because of the distance of time of me not, since being a child. It's been 1 or 2 years since then. And so it really was a real learning process for me, and quite cathartic too, because it allowed me to get back again to my culture, really, that I was born and raised in, that I've been separated from for so long.
The images of your mother in that book, for me, are some of the most profound in the book. Particularly, it took my breath away when you were describing how if she dropped rice in the kitchen, she would pick up every grain because she'd suffered so in the war and been without food. There's the image where you're singing the duet with your mother, "Oh Hazy Moon," and how years later that still gets you.
Yeah.
And just her preparing your after school snack and your food and preparing all of your food with such care. This book is for her?
I really wanted to honour her memory, and also my uncle, Oki Oji-chan, big uncle,
yes,
who just, especially that generation, love was expressed very differently. You never said it. It was never tactile, but you just knew from the things people did for you, and most of it was around food. And yeah, I didn't have children. I don't have siblings. My mother wasn't very well, so I was the only one. And I just wanted to keep her alive, I suppose, in the minds of people who've never met her. Because she was quite a remarkable person, I think. Very unusual, I think, for a Japanese woman at that time. And really should have, in my mind, should have been a writer. She read, absolutely consumed books and
in
wrote
which
little
languages?
snippets. Japanese, always Japanese. She did try in English, but she'd read English classics in Japanese translation, and everything from Thomas Hardy to the latest contemporary novel coming out in Japan as well. And she died too young, really. She was the age I am now. She's in her 50s, and I just wanted to make sure she was she was left. It remained somehow in book form.
Yeah. Well, I now feel I know something of her. There's elements of her that I see in my mother that I also lost very young. But in particular, what I see is your relationship with your mother. I really drew a lot from that, the humour, the trust, the disappointment that you could have in each other sometimes.
Yeah.
But just the superb relationship, the uniqueness of it.
I'm so pleased.
Yeah.
We were so silly together.
Yes.
But it was a relief, really, from the grind of starting up, as a young adult in a working life and after university. And we just laughed a lot.
Now, Meshi means rice or meal.
Yes.
But you don't hear many women use that word in polite company. So why did you name your book Meshi?
Well, like cherry blossom, there are many, many words for rice, depending on, what form it's in. So cooked rice is known as gohan. Kome is uncooked rice. And gohan to me just it sounds a bit sort of prosaic and boring. But more than that, meshi is a word which isn't really acceptable to be used by women. Japanese is a tremendously gendered language. So, even the word for I, which you don't say very often, but the personal pronoun for a man, an older man is different from a young boy, is different from a young girl, is different from a woman. And so when you use male language as a woman, you're making a point. And I use a funny example. My cousin Asako, when she was very little, was sent to tell my grandmother that lunch was ready. And she said, お昼ご飯召し上がってください。父ちゃんも飯食ったから。And I put the translation, the best way I could put it was, dearest grandmother, please do come and enjoy the repast that has been prepared for you because dad's already scoffed his nosh. And she was repeating what my uncle had said. And he used the word meshi, right?
Yes.
So meshi is a very coarse kind of a word. It's also used in rural communities. So there's an element of class. And I just thought it was a good word to use to represent food, the most important element of Japanese food being rice, and also to sort of really make my statement that I'm a bit of an outsider.
And I think in the book you describe yourself as a shapeshifter, always trying to do the impossible to fit in. For example, at the Omakoshi festival,
Yes.
You'd almost cry because in there with the group, when you're carrying that portable shrine with the community and the group, you feel as if you almost fit in.
Yes, I did as a child. I really didn't feel myself to be any different as long as I didn't see my face reflected anywhere.
You say, in the experience of eating, my body forgot its cultural confusion. So in that sense, you were absolutely Japanese. So the prospect of going to an English boarding school at the age of 11, how was that?
I have no words, unbelievably, for someone who talks a lot. It was just such a shock that I think I went into a bit of a state of disassociation in order to survive, because there were 3 terms, each one was 13 weeks long, and the homesickness, well, if you've ever felt it, there's a good reason why it's called sickness. The food was, apart from the Cumberland sausages, oddly, that came from a local farm, but everything else was truly, some of it was inedible. Boiled ox liver, huge, great grey hunks of liver that were impossible to swallow down. And, I feel terribly ungrateful when there are people in the world who have nothing to eat at all. But going from being a latchkey kid in central Tokyo, getting the bus, having a Japanese breakfast, taking my bento lunch, to sleeping in a dormitory of 27 girls in a 1970s boarding school, where most of the girls had never seen an Asian person before, where the food was just appalling. That, I think, was life transforming in not necessarily the best way, and I'm sort of trying to undo a lot of the damage I think that was done at that time. But yeah, it was an experience, to say the least.
You did get some sanctuary with your English grandmother.
Yes.
And I have to say that you were very fortunate to have great cooking on both sides of the family. She sounded like a wonderful cook, but also a wonderful woman.
Yeah.
And
she was a phenomenon, my grandmother.
Tell me a little about her.
Oh, goodness me. She was I'd say she was a feminist before feminist. I mean, she was no nonsense. she was quite posh, and very businesslike. And she was a great fan of the Girl Guides. Her motto is always be prepared. And she had a fascinating life because my grandfather worked for Royal Insurance and was responsible for insuring, I think, some of the sherry that was being shipped from Spain. And this was before the Civil War in Spain. And so they lived in Spain for quite some time. She learned fluent Spanish and was reading Don Quixote by Cervantes in Spanish to her dying day, and was involved in everything, amateur dramatics and, the bring and buy and the church and the flowers, and active, came to Japan, insisted on coming by ship because I think when they were evacuated, when the family was evacuated from Spain, they went via Gibraltar and by ship, and she loved traveling by ship. My father worked for a shipping company and she insisted she wanted to sail to Japan. And my father was involved with car carriers. So she ended up on this massive car carrier coming to Japan. And I think I'm sure none of the crew that were working on the ship at the time will ever have forgotten her. She was a real character.
That is an image coming out on a car ship.
It was a big, ugly, orange, hulking thing. And she said, I don't think I'll sail again next time. She'd had enough.
Cured
Of her need to be on a ship all the time.
But how extraordinary for you look back a few years, your mother in Japan, her in England, on opposite ends of World War II.
Yeah.
And yet they liked each other.
Yes. Yeah. They were very fond of each other. I think when my mother she'd never left Japan, flew to England to marry my father in a civil ceremony. And I think the families on both sides had been quite concerned about this incredible sort of cultural clash. But as soon as my English family met my mother, they were utterly charmed by her and really looked after her. And yeah, my grandmother and my mother got on tremendously well, and they had a lovely time when she came to stay. She came to stay in Japan as well as in Singapore. And I think she had a really memorable time, my grandmother.
Yeah. You've shared so much of yourself in this book, and you give and then you give and then you give, which as a reader we love. We love to be given insights and explanations, and you give so much of yourself. Was that hard?
It was incredibly hard because, and I didn't expect it to be that way, because I just thought it would be a fairly straightforward selection of stories and telling a little bit about Japanese culture. But I keep saying I'm really looking forward to writing the next novel, because I can just make it all up, There's that element of knowing that there are people alive who will have been around. The things that I write about will involve those people who are still around. And then the completely unexpected result of unearthing memories that really, literally were completely repressed. And when they popped up, it was a shock. I'm wary at overusing the word trauma, certainly, in my life, because in many ways I'm so tremendously privileged. But it was a re-traumatizing, in a way, of certain things that were going on, boarding school, and the feeling of kind of separation. I hadn't really realized when I was dispatched at 11 to English boarding school that was it. That was the end of me and Japan, really, in lots of ways. I mean, I kept going back, but, I never lived there again. I would stay for, I did a bit of work there and things, but it's just not the same. So it was very hard. And I also, I think I must have cut a whole other book from that original manuscript, because I wrote down a lot of things, a purging, that was probably a bit too personal, but in some ways I needed to get that out in order to unplug the rest of it. And there is something tremendously exposing about writing about your personal life. I never thought I would do it. And I thought I would be able to avoid it with my original plan for Meshi. But I realized two things. One was not to write about those things would make it, to me, inauthentic. And contrived in a way. And the other thing was that when I started writing this manuscript, we were, I think, within 6 months of the pandemic. And I was reminded really of what artists said who were, working at the turn of the 20th century, what happened after the First World War, when you just couldn't continue painting cottages and fields anymore after, 836,000 young British men died during the First World War. I know that several thousand Australians died, Anzacs died. And can you paint pretty pictures and tell fun stories, at a time like that? And I know you can't quite equate pandemic to First World War, but there was that tremendous sense of anxiety that we all had.
It was a social shift.
It was, wasn't it? This total, I do love the word discombobulation, but it really was. We just didn't know what was going to happen. There was this uncertainty. And so just writing these fun stories, it really didn't work for me. And that's when the meatier stuff started to come out, and it was personal. And as I went, I thought, I can't write this. I can't write about this. I can't write about my mother's death in this detail. I did tone it down a lot with the help of the wonderful editors at Affirm Press, because, that was more like a therapy rather than something someone would enjoy reading.
What you did share was, it was enough. It was perfect. And it made me feel as if I had met you and met your family. And you say in your book, being hafu, which is half Japanese, half English, meant you had to search for a self that lies deeper than cultural identity.
Yeah.
So has this book helped you to rest easy with who you are?
I think so. I'm not quite there, maybe. I think there's continued exploration to be done, but I feel as though I've made peace with that amputation. I did call it an amputation from my culture because it was sudden and complete. So I've come to terms with it. And you know how I can tell? Someone asked me, have you watched Midnight Diner on Netflix? So it's a beautiful series set in a tiny little old school snack joint in central Tokyo. And people gather around food. Every episode focuses on a particular kind of food. And there are these little stories that go on. And I'd seen it was on. I tried to watch it. This is before I wrote Meshi. And, I had to switch off. I felt a bit sick. It made me feel too sad. And it was too close to something I hadn't dealt with. And I hadn't actually realised that's what it was until I realised I had now come to terms with that loss of my culture through writing Meshi. And I tried watching it again, and I love it.
Oh, that's so good to hear.
I feel really warm and lovely inside when I watch it. And that was the biggest sign to me that something had shifted inside.
That was Katherine Tamiko Arguile, author of Meshi, A Personal History of Japanese from Affirm Press. And wasn't she wonderful?
She was. What an amazing story.
She's someone, when I met, she's about my age, she's in her 50s, and I just wanted to hug her. Her sense of loss is quite profound, having left Japan as an 11-year-old to go to boarding school. It's just tragic, and I found her quite wistful in her search for her roots. And I don't know, I loved it. I hope everyone else loves it too.
And as we just heard too, food writing goes way beyond recipes and method. Remember how your mother used to write little things in the margins of the recipes? Like, please use caster sugar or whatever. Did your mother do that?
Absolutely. Hers was always good with a bit of ginger.
Of course, the only problem is these days online, recipes have gone way beyond that. They've gone too much into that world of telling your life story around your recipe.
Yeah, I don't need to know about you, your 7 kids and your 3 dogs. Just give me the recipe.
And what the neighbours brought in at the time and how much you enjoyed eating it. Yes, exactly.
Oh, no.
But I guess that is all because food is so central to our lives and our culture, and we cook and talk, and life in the kitchen goes on around us. We talk about, how we cooked it when it's on the table, and every new recipe is an adventure. And so cookbooks have kind of become like stories. And I found the perfect person to talk about this. Kate Jordan Moore is a devoted foodie. She's one of those people who don't just know everything about food, but she also knows about the history of food and also about the way our attitudes to food have developed from the old ways. I went to visit her to check out her sundoku, and she surprised me with a relic from the past.
This cookbook isn't really a cookbook. It's what most households would have had, and it was called a receipt book. And you can look through the handwriting of about 4 or 5 generations of women of my family, from my great-great-grandmother, and then the next grandmother, and then the next grandmother. And then my mother didn't write in it very much, but she was a woman of the 60s. It's recipes that were given to them, so letters and other people's handwriting. By the 40s and 50s, there's lots of clippings. You start seeing changes in ingredients that become available. You suddenly get all of those recipes that have pineapple in them because Golden Circle suddenly appears on the scene. We forget how ingredients are now so well packaged for us that we have access to good scales and we have access to good measures. And I love all the old ones where they would say equal weight. So if you're 4 eggs, you put the 4 eggs on one side of the scales and then it would be the equal weight of sugar or the equal weight of flour. And the funny ones that would be a teacup of the liquid, and they're not impossible to cook now, but we've become a little bit more scientific.
And looking at this, how unscientific does it look, but how wonderful, what a record of the past it is.
These were the kind of day books, receipt books, and recipe comes from receipt. I love the ones that say Meg Black caramel fingers, and one of the famous recipes in our family is Mrs. Dr. King's Christmas cake, not Mrs. King, but Mrs. Dr. King, to add bonus authority. At some juncture, someone has tried to index it, going by this handwriting, I think in about 1910. But it's so fragile that I just basically keep it in a box and only bring it out for special visitors.
Travelling through the years from this precious document in front of us to these days, what are the ones that changed the game in the world of cooking and recipe reading, do you think?
It's the Penguin paperbacks that arrived about 55 years ago, that were absolute paperbacks. There was not a picture in them. There was the Jane Grigson, Elizabeth David, Claudia Roden, who's still publishing to this day. All of those really lift Australian cooking, and travel really lifts Australian cooking. So people have gone overseas and eaten interesting things and are more prepared to experiment. Publishing realises, there is money to be had in recipe books, and you start getting beautifully illustrated ones and then beautifully photographed ones.
That was a real turning point, I feel. You talked about the Penguin books with no pictures, but suddenly it's like food porn became the norm, and now it's certainly the norm in any bookshop you go into.
Yeah, there certainly were great coloured cookbooks in the 70s. Hamlin was one of the great Australian publishers of cookbooks. But I think it's really the 80s when you start getting that almost how to do restaurant food at home. So some of it's the technology, some of it's the culture. Colour printing was so expensive for such a long time that it was reserved for lavish art books or, the real gift books rather than the old-fashioned books of household management. The 80s, that's when you start getting the celebrity chef and the name of the author sells the book rather than necessarily the desire to spend 17 hours making that dish.
So it's marketing behind this, really, isn't it?
It is marketing, and it is, sheer capitalism, what will sell, but it also was a genuine desire to share recipes and knowledge as well.
Which continues, I suppose.
Continues. There are, lots of us who don't like some of the cooking shows that are based on competition, but love the ones that are about sharing or skill-based or, travel especially, combined travel and food, and you've really got a cellar. But food still always comes back to pleasure, the pleasures of the table, the pleasures of sharing. Australia's incredible luck of having such enormous range of produce and ingredients available.
We're sitting in front of not only your wonderful historical document here of the ledger of your great-grandmother, but we've got a pile of more current books, including Stephanie Alexander.
The Cook's Companion is the classic, and that's the one that ever since it's been published, every time a child leaves home, not just our children, our nieces, our nephews, whatever, everybody gets a copy of that. We don't wait for weddings or whatever. That's you move out, you need this. And she's done a really great new one called, I think it's called The Young Cook or The Apprentice Cook. Less dense and less intimidating for young people who want to cook. I've chosen also what you can tell the ones that I use a lot because they've all got yellow sticky marks. They've all got yellow, they don't have fingerprints, but they have yellow sticky notes. I love modern Middle Eastern food. I love the way Australians have embraced Middle Eastern food in all of its variations. So anything that Greg and Lucy Malouf do, I really, really enjoy. This one in particular is arabesque. They've done quite a number since then, but this is the one that I enjoy the most. And again, I might not stick to the recipe exactly because like Otto Lengi, they can wind up with an awful lot of ingredients, 2 kilos of ice cubes. But you often, just the titles will give you a bit of inspiration. Arabic pancakes with fresh mangoes and orange blossom clotted cream. You just go, oh yeah, I can put something in the pancakes. Oh yeah, I can use something other than frozen berries that are out of season. Spice Notes is, again, this is the reference where I might know that I'm going to already be doing a lamb dish, but I just want it to be a little bit different than the classic lamb roast. And Ian Hempel, who comes from a long line of spice merchants, his compendium is organised by spice with its history, which I love. I do love the history of different ingredients and knowing that the Dutch traded Manhattan so that they could keep control of the nutmeg plantations in Indonesia. That's why the Dutch left New York and it became New York. It was New Amsterdam. And of course it has herbs in it as well, mint and those things that we feel very familiar with but are used differently in different cultures. And I love books like this that not just give you recipes but also have a bit of a shorthand of how you use the seeds or how you use the leaves or what they combine with. Sumac is a spice that we've seen moving out of restaurant kitchens and into home kitchens. And so the chapter on sumac gives you its history, tells you its flavour group, which in this case is tangy, its names in other languages, suggested quantities, and then what it complements. So it complements tomatoes, avocados, sandwiches, fish and chicken, grilled and roast meats. It's used in what spice blends it's used in, which it's used in za'atar, and what it combines with. So it goes well with oregano, paprika, parsley. So it gives me ideas of how to be experimental.
So the one we've got here has got glorious illustrations, Wollonga almonds, stories and recipes.
This is a sentimental favourite. This is by my friend Helen Bennetts, who is really an architect by trade, but lives on an almond orchard in Wollonga and researched the entire history of almonds and the history in Wollonga. So it's a very place-specific book. But I love it, not just for its pictures, but she has pulled together all of the great kind of almond recipes, which we had in some ways forgotten, how almonds were used so much in Jewish cooking, how almonds are so useful if you are gluten-free or cooking for someone who doesn't eat gluten, how almonds can complement savoury recipes, and of course it's just full of the beautiful images of our beautiful Wollonga area, but also, surprisingly, how the almond blossom was used as a selling point for travel long before wine was for that region.
Okay, now we've got another. Let me see, recipes from Melva.
So while I've inherited that amazing collection of recipes that go back 3 or 4 generations, this is one of my favourite books that my friend Grant Knoll put together. He's a photographer by training, a press photographer, but his mother was a fantastic domestic cook. She enjoyed cooking. She had many friends born in foreign countries. She made friends with the Greeks that had just arrived in Williamstown in Melbourne, and then later on with the Asian communities that arrived in that area. They didn't necessarily eat out a lot, I think, that family, but they cooked and enjoyed it and were very much the family that shared a table together. So Grant has collated not just the recipes and
lovely old pictures of that spidery handwriting.
Yes, he's photographed the actual recipes that are on all sorts of bits of paper in all sorts of handwriting, but also tidied them up in the more formal section, or whatever you call it, the
So you
modern.
can actually read them.
So you can actually read them, and they read more like a contemporary recipe, and tells the stories of how Melva wound up knowing more about Vietnamese cooking in the 70s than we did in the 80s, and there are pictures of her with the things. So for me, it is all the things I love about food. It's about sharing, it's about family, it's about the table, a bit of history, a bit of tradition, even though some of them aren't traditional recipes and some of them do make you go, really, I am not going to do the chicken with mango. It is just a variation on the chicken with apricot, but it honours those women who cooked.
And who were adventurous, I suppose, in those days too.
And were adventurous and were interested in trying something new, who didn't just, for whom it was often a creative outlet. We talk about creativity now as understanding it's essential for our good mental health. It's having a creative outlet, whether that's knitting or writing or singing in a pub choir. For a lot of these women, many of whom also worked, cooking for the family, the way to stop it from being a chore was to make it a creative outlet.
Definitely. Now, there's one last book here on your pile of favourites, which is intriguing me, called Crazy Water, Pickled Lemons.
Yes, Diana Henry is a great writer and a great recipe writer, and while there are variations of these recipes by more famous chefs, and in fact you would find variations of these in any of the Otto Lenghis, this was probably the first book I bought that really combined all of the Mediterranean. That it wasn't Mediterranean cooking that was only Greek and Italian, that it included Africa, that it included the Middle East, that included that north part of Spain, and crosses and melds them. So you get delicious combinations of spices and herbs. There's a lavender cake recipe in here that I use all the time because lavender grows so brilliantly in Adelaide. Panna cotta, but using yogurt and honey. And it really was one of the first I bought that made me think about how my cooking could use not just what was available in the central markets, but look at what grew really, really well in South Australia, like lavender, like the Kangaroo Island honey, like, I don't think it exists anymore, but the sheep's milk yogurt from Kangaroo Island just made the most fantastic panna cotta. How, if you understood that South Australian has a classic Mediterranean climate, then you look to those climates for inspiration for your cooking. And that's not just Italy and Greece.
That was Kate Jordan Moore showing me around her amazing selection of recipe books, all of which are very clean, I have to say, unlike mine. We discussed the fact that some people cook on their recipe books and other people keep them very clean.
A crunchy cookbook's a better cookbook, I think.
I think so. You know which ones you're going back to then, don't you?
Yeah. You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for addicted readers.
I'm Clara Byrne and I am 11, turning 12 this year. My first real novel that I read was the BFG, and I remember borrowing that from the library, and I really, really liked that, and I couldn't put it down. Up until now, I still really like Roald Dahl, ever since I was in year 1. I like reading series, especially fantasy series, and yeah, I'm a very big Harry Potter fan. I like reading before bed, and I like reading during the day if I have time, and at school we have silent reading as well. I have just finished reading this book called Wings of Fire, which is the first book in that series, and it's a fantasy series, which I'm really enjoying. My friends do like to read books, but I'm probably the person who reads the most books out of my friendship group. I just find it a really relaxing way to calm down. Like, if I'm really stressed after a big day at school or something, I can just pick up a book and I can read, because I know it's not in real life, but it feels real to me.
Or if you'd like to share your reading habits and your reading history, do get in touch. You can record yourself using what you just heard as a guide and send an MP3 to sundokucast@gmail.com.
time for us to go, but just finally, we've got an important point to clear up. Since I talked to Katherine Tamiko Arguile, it seemed the ideal opportunity to settle once and for all exactly how we should be pronouncing the name of our very own podcast.
We did do some serious Googling at the time, but as Katherine pointed out, it seems we have to stand corrected.
It's tsundoku.
Oh, we've been saying it very, very incorrectly. Sundoku.
Tsundoku.
Sundoku.
So the emphasis slightly on the first syllable. I think the tendency is to anglicise the emphasis, which is perfectly natural.
Yeah.
So I bet it's usually tsundoku. That's what I hear is tsundoku.
Yes.
It's tsundoku.
Sundoku.
Yeah.
So there you go. I'm sorry to all of our Japanese listeners. We've been saying it incorrectly for a very long time, and Lord knows we're probably going to keep saying it incorrectly, so do forgive us. It's a lot harder to say, but we'll try and say it properly now. Goodbye from Sundoku.
And happy reading. Talk soon.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts who are refusing treatment.
Annie Hastwell.
Kath Keneally.
Sarah Martin.
And me, Michaela Andreev. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. And if you want to know more about the books, the authors, or the music featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU Cast.